So today is Tu B'Shvat, Parshat Beshalach, Tafshin Pei Dalid. So I would assume that anybody who's going to kind of try to pivot and do some kind of a Tu B'Shvat thing with this week's Parsha, so the way that you do it is you go to Perek Tedvav, Pasuk Kaf Hey, where water, the water, we have water, but it's not sweet, which also goes to how we complain. Vayitzak el Hashem, vayareo Shem etz, vayashlech el hamayim, vayimteku hamayim. Sham sam lachol mishpat sham nisel. So most likely you would do something with this, how that somehow the tree, the nature, takes away the bitterness. By the way, bitter is mar. Mar in Gematria is 240. 240 in Gematria is Amalek, which actually may be quite interesting or important, but I am getting way ahead of myself. So I said that is the proverbial low-hanging fruit. So why would we go for the low-hanging fruit even on Tu B'Shvat? So let's go back, and I'm gonna try to do something which I've done before. So for their complete apologies, even though when I did it before, I did it completely differently, and I'll explain that as we go on. And that is what I did the last time is I really focused on something that the Vilna Gaon said, and I tried to then connect it to other things the Vilna Gaon said, and then try to show how the Vilna Gaon has a particular teaching over here, but you don't understand what I'm saying yet because I'm getting way ahead of myself, and I'm not going to go there, and which is why it's going to be a bit different today, even though I'm going more or less down the same path, but I'm saying it's more or less. There's a less rather than more. So I will explain all of this. One more thing about Tu B'Shvat, and that is that, downstairs, anybody wants to join, they're having some kind of a Tu B'Shvat celebration. They're planting non-fruit bearing something, which is completely preposterous. For anyone who needs to know, the first person who had this wonderful idea to plant on Tu B'Shvat was in 1890, a fellow named Zev Yavitz, who you may recognize from his 14-volume history series of Jewish history. You may not recognize him from that either, but he was teaching something which I would say is like high school, and he had this great idea, let's get a day off today and let's go outside, and then it was adopted by the teachers union. Teachers union said, wow, this is a good idea. And just recognize the real issue, and that is that there's no holidays for a stretch of time here, especially when you have two Adars. Then you need some kind of a day off. So this became like a really good idea. There's a letter from Rav Kook by the time he's back. But see, that's actually authentic. Or when I say authentic, in a limited sense. Because among Chachmei Ashkenaz in the Middle Ages, it was debated whether you say Tachon or not. The only thing there is about Tu B'Shvat which is authentic is that it is and that's Machloket Behilam Bet Shammai, it's a demarcation about Trumot and Masrot, which means you can't give Trumot and Masrot from one year to the next, so one is the year over, so the year is over this one. Presumably, this is the time of year that, this part is true, Hashkedia Parachat. It's when things start to grow again, so therefore the new fruit that grows, you can't take Truma from the new fruit, from the old fruit, on the old fruit from the new fruit. This is a demarcation, which means it's not a holiday for trees. That's this terrible secret. It's a holiday for the fruits of the trees. So planting some bulbs is a really nice thing to do. And it's a holiday which has this wonderful combination of some Kabbalistic sources, some probably Shabbatian, Shabtai Tzvi sources, probably made up the Seder, and then you have this whole Zionist infusion as well. So if you want, I gave a whole lecture on this, and I can direct you to it, but you don't have to waste your time now, because now you heard the bottom line. You heard it on a scale of 1 to 10. What was it?
It was good.
It was a
little depressing. After 25 years of doing Seders,
It's only depressing if your expectations are high. Take down your expectations, and then it'll be wonderful. So now we're going to start. And of course, when we talk about trees, which I already told you, it's not really about trees, it's about the fruit of the trees. But when we talk about trees, you know where we go to look for our fruits. And we're going to start with source number 1, which is the Tikkunei Zohar. And it starts with, and this is a Hebrew translation because I have a little bit of compassion for you. V'ha'etz shel eitz hadat tov v'ra, tzarech la'asot bo perud ben tov l'ra. So, take a deep breath now, and let's try to understand this. When it comes to the tree of Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, So this should be obvious if it's Tu B'Shvat, which trees we're talking about, or the fruits of which trees. So when you're talking about the tree of the Eitz Hadat Tov Ra, Tzorech Lasot Perud Ben Tov L'Ra. You need to do a separation between good and bad. Another way, or a different terminology other than Perud, separation, again, there's a Hebrew translation, would be to do a birur, levarer. Borer is one of course, the 39 melachot, which somehow is connected to agricultural things, where you separate good from bad. You separate, or right, you take away the bad, and then you leave the good. So over here, also the separating. Now, this may be, what are you separating? You separate the good from bad, the bad from good. So we don't know yet. So what the Zohar is saying over here is, and by the way, this is the Tikkun Zohar. So remember, there are Tikkunim taking place over here. So the Tikkun, the fixing over here, is the separation between the good and the bad, which is the separation between the light and darkness. Now, light and darkness is pretty stark. So to separate between light and darkness should be something which is not so challenging. You need to separate the bad so that the person is left with the good, and there's no Yetzer Hara, which means theoretically it was ingesting from the Eitz Hadat Tov Ra, which gave us the Yetzer Hara. So now I know that that's a little challenging. So Metatron is an angel. Leave Metatron for a moment. Memtet over here means 49. It's the 49 which really emerges from the essential aspect of the name Metatron is the 49. Haim arba'im v'tesha panim tahor, which means separating between good and bad, pure and impure. There is tahor and there's tameh. So there's a number of places in Chazal that speak about the 49 levels of tameh and the 49 levels of tumah. And by the way, let's remember, because part of what we want to get back to is leaving Egypt. And leaving Egypt, you know this Kabbalistic idea that we sunk down to the 49th level of tumah. So over here, now realize also leaving Egypt. If we are in the midst of tumah, part of what we're going to need to do to leave Egypt is to somehow emerge, separate, to extract ourselves. That's the word, to extract ourselves from that tumah. Now, it could have been before I started saying all of this, we all imagine that leaving Egypt is something which is geographical, or leaving Egypt is something which is political, or leaving Egypt is something perhaps which is economic. But over here it's talking about something which is completely spiritual, and we haven't gotten to Egypt yet. All that we've gotten to so far is that when you separate something good from bad, I mean, later on we're going to learn in the Torah when it speaks about certain sexual outrages, it says, and don't do the practices in Egypt. Which means, no, you need to separate, not just from Egypt, but from Egyptianiyut, Mitzriyut, you need to separate from as well, and you cannot have taken that out with you. That's something which has to be left far behind. So again, what we have over here is this Perud, or Levarer, and he's starting with Metatron. Metatron is actually really interesting because if you happen to have at home, I know some of you don't, but if you happen to have at home a book which is called Malachei Elyon, which is an encyclopedia of angels. It's written by Reuven Margoliot, it's published by Mossad Rav Kook, and he has half the book on good angels, half the book on bad demons, and you can find Metatron. A lot of material on Metatron, very, very popular angel. It's made it into comic books and so on. And Metatron is very good PR on Metatron. Metatron, according to at least one source, used to be a person who lived during a time of darkness. And that person was Chanoch. Everyone was evil and Chanoch was good. So there was a birur that took place. And if you read the Targum Yonatan on the pasuk there, that Einenu ki lakachoto Elokim, that he no longer is among those that live below, those who are this generation of wicked people, rather he goes up and he becomes somebody who is good. So again, this idea of the Pirud and mentioning Metatron and mentioning now that Metatron represents the 49 levels of Panim, Shel Tahor. Now also the Panim over here is interesting because one of the ways that Metatron is going to be described is going to be the Sar HaPnim. Anybody who read my book, Crowns on the Letters, or for that matter, if you read the Agadah without reading my book, Crowns on the Letters, about Elisha ben Avuya when he goes up into heaven during whatever vision that is of Pardes, is that he sees Metatron, whose job it is to write all the things. So he is the one whose job it is to write the good deeds of Israel, and because Elisha ben Avuya had a bad day, then all of his good deeds got thrown away, and that is definitely a bummer. So this job that he has is described in some places is as the Sar Hapnim. You have the Melech, and then you have the Sar Hapnim, and the Sar Hapnim is the one who's in charge of all kinds of things. Now, all that may be important for another reason, which I will already tell you now. If you look on source number 1, if you look on footnote number 1, just to save space, we did some footnotes here. Now, this is a footnote just directly dealing with who Metatron is. So there's a book called the Zohar Chai. The Zohar Chai is relatively more recent. It is written by a great Hasidic Rabbi, and he writes that, from Kamarna, if you need to know, Vayikra ach Yosef Chanoch Metatron, Vayikra ach Yosef Chanoch Metatron Nar Yosef Hashchina Karala Metatron Shehu Yosef, which is telling you right away. And now the other thing that we always seem to get back to, other than Gar David, is to getting back to Yosef. Yosef is also the Sar Hapnim. Yosef's job down here below somehow is connected to Metatron's bar, and they're both called Nar. That's part of what that Nar Ivri. And this is also, he's young and he's taken and so on, which is Chanoch. Again, all is relative, but now you realize there's this Yosef aspect. If you look right under that, a book called the Megale Amukot, he writes, which is the best name, I think, of any book ever written, Yosef besod Na'ar Metatron, v'hu Na'ar. Umoshe lakach atzmot Yosefimo, because Metatron is also called Na'ar, and Yosef is called Na'ar, and therefore this connection between Yosef and Metatron. Umoshe lakach atzmot Yosefimo, which hopefully now you realize took us right back to this week's Parsha. Ratzalomar hakoach shel Yosef. It's the spiritual power of Yosef, which now you realize is also connected to Metatron. So maybe now you think you understand a little bit. Let's go back to the first source. Ukeneged memtet min Metatron, heim arbim v'tesha panim tahor, umitzido shel Samael. Now some don't even like to pronounce it. Arbim v'tesha panim tahor, which is the 49 levels of, Keneged, right? Arbim v'tesha panim tameh. So if you look at the footnote on him, Vayivater Yaakov Vado, Vayavek Ishimo, Zeh Samael Saro Shel Esav. So what you're back to now when I talk about this pirud or this birur, this extraction, it would seem to be that things need to be extracted when they are completely fused together, which means this connection, and maybe this is simple, maybe it's not simple. But the separation between Yaakov and Esav is a profound separation. Rivka, be able to be prepared for that, she needs a prophecy to be able to understand that there is a separation, and they're going into two different directions. So now, what's important about it, so far we got to like 4 lines in this source, and what we understand is that we need there to be a separation. We didn't get to Egypt yet. We understand part of this basic separation is going to be ultimately between Yaakov and Esav, but it's interesting because some of us know, and maybe we'll see some of it later on, this is just a little foreshadowing, that when it comes down to the war against Esav, it's actually going to be fought by Yosef, or for that matter, Mashiach ben Yosef, and so on. So therefore, the existence here, and right here, Metatron and Samael, which means this angel which somehow represents, this good angel, somehow represents Yosef, and then something represents Esav, the power, then these are these powers, and they need to be separated. They need to go in different directions. So therefore, at least maybe some of us can understand a little bit of where this is going. Umisha zochel lechaber hey, and hey represents, of course, God. One of the names of God, Yud Hey Vav Hey. Misha zochel lechaber hey labrim v'tesha panim shel tahor. So what's the hey? Shehu chamisha chumshei Torah, 5. Now what happens when we add 5 to the memtet? What do you end up with? Don't give me a numerical answer because it's wrong. Naaseh mateh. Memtet and hey becomes a mateh. And what, of course, is a mateh? A mateh is the staff. Mateh lahakotbo et yitzro, which means we talked at the very beginning of here, getting rid of Yetzer Hara and getting rid of all the tamei and being able to get rid of the Yetzer Datov Bara, to get rid of the Ra. So how do you do this? You need to give your Yetzer Hara 10 makot, right? In order to be able to do this, you need to align to Torah. You need to align to the places of purity. And when Torah aligns with purity, then you suddenly have this magical ability to be able to get rid of the Yetzer Hara. Now, so far, that is what the Zohar has been telling us. Lakot et Yitzro im ha'ot Yud. Why? Why Yud? The Yud is the 10 makot. Shehu eser makot. V'hainu hainu hayud min Elokim. So you take away, now again it writes Elohim here, take away the Yud, or add the yud, and we'll see what happens if you take away the yud, or if we take away the hey for that matter. Umishum kach nikra mate Elokim, and that's why it's always called mate Elokim, because this goes together. Now, what you now may have recognized is, we're talking about the Yetzer Hara, and we're talking about separation, but now you realize that the metaphor which has been used is a metaphor which comes right out of our leaving Egypt story. And that's really what we're up to, is leaving Egypt, even though I made believe that we're talking about Tu B'Shvat. But now we're up to leaving Egypt, and now we're there with the Mateh. And all of you have heard, again, that Kabbalistic idea that we sunk down to the 49th level, and now you realize why that is connected to all this as well. Ubal HaMateh Hazeh Huvav. The one who has the Mateh, that's connected to the letter Vav. Vav is always a connector. Vav always means there's a connection, right? Yes, a vav in the Mishkan, a vav. The word vav are all the connectors. The vavim are connectors. The letter vav connects the two things. So a vav is always a connector. Ubala mateh hazeh vav shenambao hinei nochi koreit brit. Neged kol amcha shekoreit imo brit al shloshes midot shorachim shelo yachzor rekam bitfilato. And the connection over here is that once a person does all this, then they're able to make a brit with God, and the brit with God means that, and the Yud Gimel Midot, which is after we mess up, after the Cheta Egel, that never comes back empty. Shelo yachzor rekam bitfilato. She'ilaim. Now you're wondering what Ilaim is. Ilaim is somebody who can't speak. She'ilaim, but Ilaim is Elokim without the Hey and the Yud. So you just now removed that Hey and just now removed the Yud, and now what you're left with is Ilaim. She'ilaim b'li Hey b'rekam. V'zeu shomer Yaakov lulei Elokei avi Elohei Avraham u'pachad Yitzchak hayali kata rekam shelachtani. Had it not been for the God, right, the God of Avraham, the God of Yitzchak, then I would have left empty-handed. Now, there's a subtlety to this, and again, I want to read a little bit more, but there's a subtlety to what's going on here, and that is we were talking about, first of all, we're talking about our neshamas. Secondly, we're talking about leaving Egypt and the Makot. And then what we're talking about now is Yaakov, and Yaakov would have gone empty-handed had it not been for God. V'lama b'shum shenamar b'Lavan v'tachlif et miskarati aseret monim. Because it says that Lavan changed his wages 10 times. Notice the word 10. 10 is going to be connected to Makot. Uva'ot yud naselo nes. Shelokim hotzimi menu ha-yud nishar ilaim. And therefore, Lavan was unable to speak. Remember, God comes to him the night and tells him, you can't say anything, good or bad. You can't speak anymore. His ability to speak is taken away. On the other hand, let's keep in mind something else. What is the koach of Yaakov? Hakol kol Yaakov. So Yaakov goes and prays, and therefore he doesn't go empty-handed. On the other hand, Lavan is left without an ability to speak. Nishar ilaim reik. Beli Torah sheba'al peh. Again, speak, without the ability to speak, and therefore without Torah sheba'al. Misha mitpalel tfilah, but somebody who knows how to pray, somebody who knows how to pray properly will not ever come back empty-handed. There's different ways of accessing or having tefillah go to God. And the only ones who know how to direct their tefillot are the ones who know the secrets of the Torah. So, first of all, I want to assure you that when I taught this last time, I did not teach the Tikkunei Zohar. This is not where I started. I may have mentioned one line in passing, but that's why I'm saying that today I'm going in a slightly different direction. What I did is really went into a bit more into source number 2, and source number 2 is the commentary of the Vilna Gaon to this passage in Tikkunei Zohar. And he says something which, after you see it, it's obvious. Before you see it, you don't think about it. On those words, Rekam Shelachtani, where Yaakov says, I would have gone empty-handed, Shehu Vav Malay Kanal Below Yud Hey, again talking again about that word, Ilaim, and Elokim to Ilaim. Ilaim, V'ha'inyan ki Yaakov v'Lavan, Dugmat Yisrael b'Mitzrayim. That Yaakov being extracted from the house of Lavan is a prototype of the extraction of Am Yisrael from Mitzrayim. So it's at this point that we have to pause again. Because how far is he going to take it? What's the answer? He's going to take it very, very far. He's going to take it further than you can imagine. But right now, and we can now paint this with the broadest of strokes and say, yeah, one is talking about leaving another culture and heading to Israel, and the other is leaving another alien culture and heading to Israel. So yeah, I guess the stories have some kind of similarity. Now, let's be perfectly honest. Other than the similarities, there are also going to be differences. And it's some of those differences which are going to be quite important in terms of where we're going. But let's continue and read the Gur again. V'nyan ki Yaakov alav dugmat Yisov b'Mitzrayim, k'mo she'amru avotem siman lebanim galut Yaakov, v'achar kach lakach et kol rechusho, k'mo she'katuv hinei re'iti et kol asher Lavan, v'chein v'yinatzlu Mitzrayim, u'v'makel lakal Lavan b'rechusho dugmat mateh to Mitzrayim. So let's now pause. He says, in both, it's not just a question of leaving. In both cases, we could have left with nothing except for the clothing on our backs. The former slaves, had we told the slaves, okay, just go, just run, we would have gone. But God says, when you go, you're going to go B'ruchush Gadol. So there is this divine promise. On the other hand, Yaakov could have worked for all these years, and his wages gets changed, and Lavan rips him off, and he ends up leaving with whatever he leaves with and gets out. But in both cases, there is this further element that somehow God does something miraculous. And in both cases, now you can tell me, oh, but they're just completely different. Yaakov does these things we still don't begin to understand unless you want to study the biological impact of birthing of stars and stripes and whatever else it may have been there. So again, it's not the easiest thing to understand what happened. God did something, and on the other hand, when it comes to leaving Egypt, so therefore God again did a manipulation, and that manipulation is that God gave the people this desire to somehow give their rechush to the Jews. But in both cases, they leave. Now, the other thing that he said is notice, and we may have missed this along the way, that when Yaakov did all of this, he actually had a staff in his hand. He had a makel. So therefore, he had a staff in his hand, and what he's pointing out is, pay attention to the staff, because it's really the same as, and this is what does the Eser Makot, and this is midah keneged midah, for the 10 times that Lavan changes his wages. So therefore he gets struck with 10, and he gets struck with 10, or they get struck with 10, and therefore he's saying that there is a little bit more similarity than maybe you realize than just a geographic move from one place to another. V'hamakel, who, right? So who, hey, and he goes, no, it's the makel. It's interesting if you look at the makel, and this I did speak about when I talked about this last time, and this is where I ended up going, because I ended up going to the Vilna Gaon's commentary on Chad Gadya, and I'll explain why I did that and why that was the major focus. Is in the Chad Gadya, of course, there's something which is called a chutra. The chutra is, those of you doing Shtay Mikra ve'Echot Targum will know that every time it says the mateh, the Aramaic is chutra. So the chutra is the mateh that Moshe is using. So it's interesting that this actually goes back to this point. Now, the reason I went to the Chad Gadya there is that he ends up focusing on what we touched a little bit, and that is Yosef and Mashiach ben Yosef. And in his commentary to the Chad Gadya, he tells us the secret of everything is Yosef. The secret of everything is Mashiach ben Yosef. Why was I concerned about that? There's a book which is called the Kol HaTorah, which is reportedly written by someone in the Rivlin family, the cousins and students of the Vilna Gaon, where he talks about the Gaon's teachings of redemption, and the whole book is about Mashiach ben Yosef. There are those who claim that the book is not authoritative and the book was written late. By the way, there are references there to He'ir, there are references there to Yom Yerushalayim, and there's some really interesting things. The book says, of course it was just written later, but the main thesis of the book is about the role of Mashiach ben Yosef, and that's in the Vilna Gaon's commentary to the Chad Gadya, which actually is published a long, long, long time before the Rivlins came about. And what I was trying to show is the authenticity of the Vilna Gaon's teaching regarding Mashiach ben Yosef. So that's why I was very, very focused on that area, and you can see how I can do that directly, but there, as I said, there are certain pivots that I want to take. Yeah. It's the same idea. It accomplishes the same thing. He then continues, I'm skipping a little bit, Ubal Hamate, it's like the line there, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines towards the end. Ubal Hamate Yaakov Dugmat Moshe Rabbeinu Olav Shalom. And Yaakov and Moshe therefore become these similar personalities, and we're skipping a little bit. Ukimoshe Barach Yaakov Ken b'Mitzrayim, And the same way that Yaakov ran away, the same thing was in Egypt. Right? Derech v'chule kamasha katuv batukin izoro pukna kadumaita denafku b'menusa v'chein derech shloshet yamim v'chein v'yugad lavan b'yom hashlishi v'chein isigu bo b'yom hashvi'i kamosha katuv v'yudoch acharei derech v'chule akol kimo b'mitzrayim. Now, if you didn't catch what he just now did, that was very impressive because we'll look at it if you didn't catch it, because that was just incredibly convincing what he said. V'chein kol hama'aseh. Everything about these two episodes, lemisha midaktek, somebody who pays proper attention. So what I really wanted to do, but it would take far more than the time that we have, is to try to go through every single thing. I mean, but it's too much, because you really have to go back from the day that Yaakov was born all the way moving forward, even though it could be that the major emphasis is going to... See, this is the question, if it's really... I mean, is the leaving of Egypt, should we be focusing on Va'era and Bo, or Beshalach, or for that matter, when we're talking about Yaakov and Esav, should we be talking about Toldot Vayetze, or should we be talking about Vayishlach? Just to note for a second, Vayishlach and Beshalach also have a similarity to it in terms of in terms of the names. One of the places, if you listen to the Kriyat TORAH this morning, you catch up again on Shabbat, is one of the places is Sukkot, and you also know that's the place that Yaakov first gets to when he gets there. So he calls the place Sukkot. So when the Vilna Gaon says, "Oh yeah, everything is the same," part of what I'm wondering is, if we would have been sitting and the Vilna Gaon is giving shir and say, "How many connections do you have? Give me a number." So again, I have no idea what that number is. I have no idea if he would say, "Oh, there are 11, there's 15, there's 38, there's 145. I mean, I think the number, when he says everything is the same, I'm suspecting that number is far higher than we imagine it right now. But what he just now gave us is incredible. But I'm going to read a little more, and then we're going to go back and try to prove the point, and then we're going to see where all this takes us. And he says, and therefore, when we tell over the story of leaving Egypt, what is the main part of the Haggadah? V'doresh me'arami ovid avi. That's why we're telling over about Lavan, right? Ubikash Lavan lakor tekol. That's why we're talking about Lavan over there, because it's part of the story, because it's the same story. Right? Right? What's Loma Hechayud, Lohushav Rekam, V'imigin the Itma Belovin V'tuchlaf, Lashiva Rekam, V'lovin Lakab Kulam, Im Ko Yoma Akodim, V'zovata Yud It Avid Leines, Kamo Bitzim Mitzrayim, Te'esa Makota, Yosar Nisim L'Yisrael, Kamashakuva Sara Nisim, Nasu, Lavotain V'chein B'Yakov, V'lovin Lakab, B'momanov, V'nitkayim B'Yakov, Kamo Mitzrayim, V'chein Yatzu B'Rechush, V'chein Yaakov Tiv, U Ma'asher La'avinu. So essentially, he gave us the Rechush as the starting point, he gave us the 10 Makot, and then he said something about leaving. Let's look to see what that is, because as I said, that's going to... First of all, the good thing, it's going to take us back to this week's Parsha. So afterwards, when you complain about the shir, that, barely talked about Beshalach, so now we get to talk a little bit more. Vayugad l'melech Mitzrayim, source 3. Vayugad l'melech Mitzrayim ki barach ha'am. So notice the phrase, they ran away. Vayugad ki barach. V'yafach levav paro. And then there's this manipulation in terms of Paro's heart, which is interesting. Because what does the manipulation do? The manipulation causes him to chase them down and will end up causing his death. Now, what he didn't mention is there also is going to be the manipulation of Lavan's heart. God is going to come to him at night, he's going to warn him, and that's going to actually cause there to be a lack of confrontation, which means there's going to be confrontation which will be verbal, but eventually he's going to be told he can't speak, and he's going to become Elaim, as it were. And there's much more, by the way, to what happens then by that confrontation. But let's notice the words Vayugad, Melech Mitzrayim, he was told, Ki barach, Vefech levav, and he goes and gets the Rechvo. By the way, the word Rechev goes back to Yosef, which I don't want to over. V'yikach sheshmo Rechev, Bachur, V'chol Rechev. I mean, right? I'm not going to bother saying much more than that. V'yechazek Hashem et leiv Paro, v'yirdof, he chased them, acharei b'nei Yisrael, v'nei Yisrael yotzim b'yad Ramah. So go back now we'll go to source number 4, which is going back to Bereshit Lamed Aleph. I want you to look, we'll start a little further down, Pasuk Kav Bet, Vayugad Lavan b'yom hashlishi ki barach Yaakov. It's the same thing. Right? The same words are there. Vayirdof acharav devich shivay amin vayidbekoto b'har galad. That's what the Vilna Gaon pointed out. He goes, it's the same words being used. That he was told, and Paro, right? Paro was told, Lavan was told. Lavan then starts chasing him down, Paro starts chasing him down. When do they catch up, and when's the confrontation? On the seventh day. So in our story, in Parshat Beshalach, so that's when the splitting of the sea takes place, and God does this other incredibly miraculous things, and then the Egyptians are all killed. But how does the story end up with Lavan? Well, it ends up slightly differently. They end up making a covenant, and in the covenant, they end up creating boundaries. There's going to be a birur, a boundary, and a real separation between the two. And we'll stop at that for the moment. Let's go a little bit further back now in source number 4. Vayishlach Yaakov yikra lo Rachel Leah. So this is after he makes the money. The attitude has changed, which of course is the beginning of the story in Shmot. The attitude towards the Jews has changed. Yosef had now the Jews, and those are the footnotes that I put, Asher lo yadat Yosef, and so on. The other thing is, he says, and I worked with all of my strength, you changed my wages 10 times, which now you realize this is also a part of that story. The other thing over here, which is interesting, is in Pasuk Yud Tet, v'lo v'nalach goes et sono, v'tignov Rachel et trafim asher la'aviha. Now that's something which we're not exactly sure what she was doing, by itself. Why is she doing this? And there's all kinds of theories why she took it. But what happens when you do what the Vilna Gaon told us to do and read this story through the prism of the other story, then I think it gets connected to the footnote that I put there by number 4, and that would be V'chol Elohei Mitzrayim eseh shvatim ani Hashem. That also the gods of Egypt are going to be judged as well. So over here, her stealing of his God now becomes much more interesting in terms of that further connection. So again, the terms here are similar. The dream the night before, Vayavo Elokim Lavan, Pasuk Kaf Daled, Arami B'chalom Halayla. Go a little bit further down. Lavan chases them down, Vayaseg Lavan, and Vayom Lavan LeYaakov, Pasuk Avav, Ma'asita Laviv, V'tanega B'nai Kishvuyot Charev. Lama nichbeita levroach v'tegnovoti v'lo higadatali. I love now that word Haggadah there is also much more interesting. And again, if the Vilna Gaon were here, I think that he would point that out as well. Lo higadatali, no. V'higadata levincha b'layla. No, you have to tell over. And again, contrast, comparison. V'eshlacha b'simcha v'shirim u'v'tof u'v'kinar. So if you notice my footnote over there, what's it going to be? It's going to be that so where did she get this idea to from the El Tazeda, Lavan, right? Lavan, listen, a bunch of Litvaks, none of them know how to party. So where do we get our party from? We get our party from Lavan. Lavan makes parties. That's what Lavan does. He makes a party for one daughter, I'll make it for another daughter, I'll make it. Lavan likes parties. So Lavan said, would I know? We would have made a party. So, but it's interesting is the two people. That's what I'm saying, is that I have no idea what number he would say, but my suspicion is it's so much beyond what we imagine right now, and that's why I would want to go over this again and again and again, really with a fine-tooth comb to try to make these comparisons, and my suspicion is that there's just an awful lot. If we'll continue a little bit, Pasuk Mem Gimel, Vayan Lavan Vayomer El Yaakov. Now I want you to note what he says, and then where he goes with this, because you can end up with the exact opposite conclusion. Pasuk Mem Gimel, and this is the key pasuk. Vayomer Lavan, Vayan Lavan Vayomer El Yaakov. Habanot Benotai. By the way, if you pause right there, but there's more, so I can't pause right there. If I would pause right there, so kill all the males and save the girls, right? So one thing, but it's not where he said. Habanot benotai v'abanim banai v'hatson soni v'kol asher tareh lihu. Everything is mine. And by the way, that power would probably agree with everything is mine. I own everything. Why? Because you're my slaves. Ul v'notai ma'aseh la'ela hayom ol v'nei asher yoladu v'ata l'cha nichrata brit ani v'ata. And he goes, therefore, let's make a covenant. And also here he talks about testimony. And the testimony is also the aid. It's going to be testimony. Which is also interesting because just in terms of the last time that Yaakov had made a matzeva, that was by the Sulam. That's a while ago. The Sulam is also quite interesting to us. But again, I'm not so much sure how much we want to go there. Vayomer Yaakov le'achav le'tu avanim v'chu avanim, which again reminds us of when Yaakov runs away, when he leaves Israel, and then gathering all the stones, and so on, and both in the Pshat and also in the various midrashim over there. Vayasu gal, v'yochlu sham al hagal, v'yikra lo Lavan yigar sahaduta, v'Yaakov kara lo gal ed. So that there is some kind of a covenant. V'yom Lavan agad hazeh ed beni uvenecha yom al ken kara shmo gal ed v'mitzvah asher yatzaf beni uvenecha ki nastar ish mereu im ta'anet benotai im takach nashim al benotai ein ish imanu. Right? Don't take any more wives, which is interesting, right? V'yom Lavan Yaakov hinei hagal hazeh v'hinei hamatzeva asher riti beni uvenecha. That this is going to now become a division. There's now going to be a fence between the two of us, and now we've created complete separation, which means the separation of Yaakov and Lavan is by a covenant, by a meal, by words of saying, I would have made a bigger party if you gave me an ability to. And he says, everything is mine, but let's create a complete separation between the two of us, which really, in a certain sense, is the opposite of one another. Because if you're saying, everything is mine, then there is no separation. Which also now lets us perhaps understand all of this a little bit more. Leaving Lavan is not just a question of geography. It's not just a question of political, geographic, economic. It's a question of creating separation and distance between the world of Lavan and the world that Yaakov is about to enter into. Of course, you can then go back and say, but Yaakov Taryag Mitzvot Shemarti, and so on and so forth, but there still needs there to be a birur, there needs there to be a separation. And I'll say, now with what we've seen from the beginning today, just like when we leave Egypt, we need there to be a separation, there needs to be distance. Of course, what's interesting then is with Lavan, it takes place by, I'll say, a proverbial handshake. We agree to be separate. Here's the boundaries. This is yours. This is mine. I'll stay here. You go there. Even though I just want to say everything is mine. So because Lavan wants to say everything is mine is why it's so important now to create the separation, which means it's almost like Robert Frost's cynicism, which gets cited as wisdom, and that is that good fences make good neighbors. And he's saying, let's create a fence. Let's create a fence, and that way we will have this ability to live our own separate lives, even though on a certain level we shouldn't, but nonetheless. And the temptation for Yaakov, perhaps, to have stayed with Lavan and stayed with family and stayed away from that other confrontation, which I don't want us to forget about. Because there is that other confrontation, which means... To a great extent. But it's that other confrontation that till now we've just completely forgotten, and that's the one that we shouldn't be forgetting, because I gave you a hint about that from the very beginning, because ultimately it's going to be the separation between Yaakov and Esav. And those of us who remember Parshat Vayishlach, there's this other thing which is waiting for us, and that is that Esav is waiting. Once we finish with Lavan, then Esav is waiting. And Esav is waiting with his soldiers. And if we go back to Parshat Beshalach, somehow when we finish our whole experience with Paro, and they're, again, completely different way of having that separation, when we leave Paro and we leave Egypt, and they end up in the bottom of the sea, and all that, then Amalek is waiting for us. Which means, again, when the Vilna Gaon says, yeah, everything is the same, of course everything's the same. Incidentally, there's another parsha with the same three letters, and that's Shlach. And in Parshat Shlach, we're also on the way to Israel. That's what's interesting, is Vayishlach, we're on the way to Israel, and Beshalach, we're on the way to Israel, and in Shlach, we're on the way to Israel, and that doesn't work out, and what happens afterwards? Then the Mapilim go and try to go by themselves, and Amalek attacks them. So therefore, Amalek is... Yes. If you want, I'll show you the pasuk.
I believe you.
It sounds like you just did. Anyway. Source 5, all that I want to look at is the first pasuk, and this we're doing very quickly because I told you in the other one I spent more time on this. When Yosef is born, that's then what generates everything. Okay, now it's time to go. It's Yosef being born is the catalyst. If you look then at source number 6, it's when this week's parsha, all the people, they take their they're primitive weapons, which really is what Vachamushim, source 6, Vachamushim alu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Yisrael. They take their weapons with, they're armed. Vayikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef. But Moshe took the Moshe. Now that was already hinted before, between the Vilna Gaon and between the Zohar, it was the koach of Yosef that he takes with him, because again, Yosef is connected to Metatron. It is connected to this ability to fight against Amalek. Noticing source number 7, when she grabs him, Vayanas Vayetzei achutza, and he runs away. In source number 8, the Mechilta points out, Shimon ish ketron omer b'schut atzmot shel Yosef ani korei lehem atayam shenemar v'yazov bigdo etzla v'yanes achutza v'chtiv hayam ra'a v'yanos hayarden yisov le'achar. That the splitting of the sea is because the sea saw Yosef, and that which is, it's the birth of Yosef, which is the catalyst to begin, and then it's Yosef's remains even, which have this ability. Everybody's armed and they think they're going to fight, but it's the remains of Yosef which causes the sea to be split. And if we go back to our battle with Amalek at the end of this week's parsha, in source number 9, Vayomer Amalek v'lechem Yisrael b'refidim, Vayomer Moshe el Yehoshua, and of course, who is Yehoshua? Yehoshua is from Yosef, from Ephraim. So and then you just notice all the other things, Matei Elokim in his hands, and Yehoshua, and then the various letters of the name of God and the name of Yehoshua, and Emunah. There is a great deal of information. Going back to the song that they sing after the splitting of the sea, Kash is important here as well. In back chapters before, when they went backwards one step, it says, now you go to Rashi, and as soon as Yosef was born, Mishanolad Sitno Shel Esav. Shenemar Beit Yaakov Esh Ubeit Yosef Lava Ubeit Esav Lakash. That means that Yosef is going to light the match and burn the straw, which is a representation of Esav. And again, we'll leave it at that. But again, there are all of these elements which come together as well, and all that is mentioned in the Gemara in source 13 as well. It's Vayishkimu Baboker Velu El, right? Parshat Shlach Rosh Hahar Leimor Inenu Valenu El Makom Asher Amar Hashem Kichatanu Vayom Moshe, and so on. Ready to go. God is not amongst you, right? Which, by the way, is actually in Beshalach before the word, because they said, "Oh, is God among us or no?" And then Amalek comes, and then Ki Amalkli B'Kani Shem Lefneichem Faltum B'Cherev. And then they go up, Vayered Amaleki B'Kani Ayoshev B'Harahu V'Yakom and so on, and they wipe them out. So yes, Amalek is there as well. So that's what I'm saying, is that there is this larger issue that needs to be paid attention to as well. But if we're going to make everything a little bit broader, then there is another element that I want to point to. And again, this is where we didn't go at all. And let me just say a couple more things about this. When I try to retrack my steps, one of the things that I didn't know is how I found that Zohar in the first place. There's certain books I can tell you that I found something because I was just learning it straight. And I was not learning that Zohar. I did not get there through my own learning. And the comment of the Vilna Gaon, I didn't get through directly, which means I must have gotten into some kind of a klisheni. So what that klisheni is, there's many, many years' worth of possibilities where it could be from. But what I did notice is that one person who does speak about it, or his students wrote about it, were the students of Rav Moshe Shapiro. So if you don't know who Rav Moshe Shapiro was, he was one of the most significant, I'll call him Balei Machshava, of the last generation. And a lot of people were his students who then teach over things that he had said. And the number of books, some better, some worse, that quote him. And I did the simple thing. I Googled that Vilna Gaon, some words from the Vilna Gaon, said, now who quotes it? And I saw people going back to various, a couple of different books, that I have at home, by the way. So there is a likelihood that I would have read it in one of those books. So I'm saying it's possible. And then as I was looking, I actually found a shir that he spoke about this. So he passed away a couple of years ago, and I found a shir. I listened to the shir this week, which was really interesting, but I did not do most of what he did. He spent a lot of time with testimony. Maybe I'll do a touch testimony. He spent a lot of time with black and white, love and is white, and the importance of separating. And he spent a lot of time with Aramaic, with that term which was used in Aramaic in the Torah, and I'm not dealing with that as well. But there was one other direction that is pointed to, and that is the continuation of the Lavan story. So in order to understand this, I first want to touch one thing, and then we'll see how all this connects. In the Az Yashir, which we already saw the Kash, in the Az Yashir in source 15, Az Yashir Moshe B'nai Yisrael, and we know the words, Zeh Keli V'anvehu. So what does that mean? This is my God, and I will beautify. Good. And then later on it says, in Pasuk Yud Zayin, it says, Mikdash Hashem konenu yadecha. So if you look at the Targum in both of these verses, in 16, the Targum says, Zeh Keli V'anvehu, Dein Eloki ve'evnele mikdash it should be. Mikdash Eloka. And I'm going to build a Beit HaMikdash. Zeh Keli V'anvehu. This is my God, and I'm going to, so beautiful, I know I'm going to build a Beit HaMikdash. In a source, in the Pasuk Yud Zayin, which is a little easier, Atar leveit shchinate et kinta, Hashem makdisha, Hashem et knei yadecha. I will build a house for God. Which means, by the way, long before the golden calf, at the sea, the people have a revelation. There is this teaching in the Mechilta that Yafilu Shivcha Bayam sees even what Yecheskel didn't see. They see a Merkava. They see a Beit HaMikdash. They see the Beit HaMikdash Shamala. They have a vision of the Beit HaMikdash Shamala, and they say, we're going to build the Beit HaMikdash. We're going to bring it down below. By the way, this should also help us with one other thing. This should also help us with the Sulam Yaakov. Because Yaakov wakes up after saying the Sulam. A Sulam is also something which connects you, and there's a vision of heaven. And then he wakes up and says, I'm going to build a Mikdash, which I'm going to build a Mishkan. And the other thing about the Sulam, of course, is that the Sulam in Gematria is 130, the way that it's spelled in the Chumash, which, by the way, is the same thing as Kol Yaakov. It's a Hakol, Kol Yaakov. Hakol is written without the Vav. Hakol Kol Yaakov, it's also 130, but more importantly, Sinai is 30. And of course, we understand that Sinai somehow ends up morphing into the Mishkan and ends up morphing into the Beit HaMikdash. If that was good, then great. If not, then also great. We're going to skip source 17 and 18 are what takes us to the Ramad Avid Avi. Right? What's right? That's the beginning of Parsha Kitavo. What was the very end of Parsha Kitayt say? Of course, that's Parshat Zachar, Amalek. Which means this, and then Kitavo is when I get to the Beit HaMikdash, which means that's not an accident. Which means there's this fight against Amalek, then you get to Sinai. There's this fight against Amalek, and then I go to the Beit HaMikdash and I bring the first fruits and I say the Ramad Avid Avi, and I go back to leaving Lavan because that's actually the beginning of the story. We'll skip 19, which is Rashi. 20 is the whole thing about the Sulam, and he's afraid, and he wakes up, and I'm going to build the Beit Elokim, and all of that we know. Yaakov, of course, is going to come later. He's going to be frightened later on again when he's about to have his confrontation with Esav, and then the night before he has a confrontation with Saroshel Esav. See, then I would actually make that nocturnal, strange section, I would actually compare it when Moshe goes into the hotel, right? The Bates Motel, right? Somebody tries to kill him. Oh, I don't know how else.
How did you call it?
The Bates Motel. Someone pulls a knife on him. You have a better way to call it? And now you're thinking, so how long I've been saving that? Since last night. It's only since last night. Only since last night. So those two scenes of Yaakov's life being threatened and Moshe, somebody said before the birth of Moshe or Moshe's life being threatened, and in that strange scene when they both emerge from that is interesting, and there are also angels in both of those scenes, right? And that's part of what's important. But again, Yaakov wakes up, and it's time to build the Beit HaMikdash, and we're going to skip through all these things having to do with being afraid and having emunah. You see in 25 Hakol, there you see the kol without the vav. Wonderful. But we really wanted to get to source 26, because source 26 is in Parshat Balak. So you're saying, why in the world are we in Parshat Balak? And that is because Parshat Balak speaks about Bilam. And why are we dealing with Bilam? So one thing that I want you to note is also there's a Malach Hashem over here Baderech, and then and there's a sword which is pulled out. We have the donkey. Pasuk Kafei Vayamod Malach Hashem b'mishol kramim gader mizeh v'gader mizeh, and there is this crossing over of the fences. By the way, also notice Vayachet Haton b'makel. Notice the makel that you may not have noticed before, and then he says Yesh li cherev biyadi, and I would have killed you, and so on and so forth. So why are we here? Source 27 is the Targum Yonatan. Vayamod malach Hashem b'dochak shvil tsar shebe'emtza ben hakromim makom shehikim Yaakov v'Lavan gal umatzeva mitzad mikan umatzeva mitzad mikan v'ishbiu shelo lavor ze hagvul ze lahara. Because what it's about to tell us, which is going to be very clear in the Medrash Tanchuma, is that Lavan is Bilam. Now, you just don't bother me with biography. Don't bother me with when they live. It's saying is that, no, you want to say reincarnation, say whatever you want, but it's saying Lavan is Bilam. Lavan bikesh lakor takol, Bilam bikesh lakor takol. And therefore, even to put Bilam as one of the advisors to Paro, to kill them all, which is interesting. Paro doesn't want to kill them all. Paro wants his slaves, but Bilam wants to kill them all. And for Lavan say, I would have done terrible things, but God stopped me. So now suddenly he seems a little bit free. But even over here, again, God is going to stop him. So if you look at Medrash Tanchuma in 28, where it talks about the Gal, Azesh Amar Katuv, Tochatzatz Regel Bilam Al Gal, Lafisha Avar Bilam et Hashvua Shenishba LeYaakov. Shenemar imlot avar tagal hazeh v'tamatziva azot l'ra ubilam ze lavan. Shenemar our army ovid avi v'al bikesh lechlot et Yisrael nikra our army. So it's saying no, that this. Meaning, if you look back where he comes from the same hometown. But it's saying no, Bilam, as descendants, perhaps if you just want to put it that way, Bilam had the obligation of keeping the vow that Lavan made. See, I want to go back a couple of steps, then we'll move a little bit more towards the end. And that is that once this birur takes place, and there are terms which take place, and there's a covenant which takes place, then that is obligatory upon the descendants as well. She's Am Yisrael, we're on this side, and right? See, let's go back a couple steps. Everything is the same. Yaakov goes as one solitary person and goes into the Beit Lavan, and he merges with all these tribes. It's the beginning of Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael go down as a small group, 70 people, and they emerge as Am Yisrael. Which is the other thing that really, when you look about these two situations, is Am Yisrael emerging. The thing which is completely different, and the reason we wouldn't have considered it even by ourselves before everything is pointed out, the thing which is so different is the way the story ends. The way the story ends is that Paro and all of his people are dead, and Lavan, we make a peace treaty, and everything is okay. So what's interesting about all of this is that it's claimed no. Sometimes enemies don't keep peace treaties. Right? Should I say that? Should I say this again? Sometimes enemies who really have in mind to destroy you, right? They don't keep peace treaties. They just become opportunities to be able to push things off as much as they can. Over here, where is Rabbeinu Bechaye? Rabbeinu Bechaye is in 33. He says that God was very upset. Why? Bilam nishtamesh b'umanot she'enu shelo. He was using skills which were not his. Hapeh natan leYaakov. Hakol is Yaakov. Shenemar hakol kol Yaakov. Ulefichach nishtamesh hamalach b'umanot she'enu shelo. She'malach shel rachamim hu haya. Right? It's Malach Hashem. So that means that part of what Bilam did is he tried to curse us with the Kol Yaakov, which, by the way, obviously should all be taking us right back to the Yaakov and Esav, and again, Amalek emerging out of all of this. The aid from the Gal aid is worthwhile pursuing. On the one hand, in our parsha, we have an edut, which is in source 34, which is the man, again, out of nowhere. Oh, put this away for Edut. So you say, where did Edut come from there? Well, there was Edut, was a key part of that other story. The other thing is eventually we're going to get to the Mishkan, And the way the Mishkan is going to be described in source 35, Asuli Mikdash, and what's going to say, V'titena te'edut asher itene lacha. So over here there is this edut by this Har Gilad, and over here we're going to have this edut by this Har Sinai, which, again, we're not going to say again the Sinai and the Sulam and so on and so forth. And that, by the way, is a gematria which is in Chazal. And finally taking it to the again, because you realize the Beit HaMikdash is the thing, and that's 36. And one of the things Chazal say is from all the blessings that Bilam gives, all of the blessings that Bilam gives, it actually gives you a hint about what he wanted to curse. And over here it says, he looks and he says, Ma tovu alecha Yaakov, mishkanotecha Yisrael. Which means what he sees is the Mishkan, what he sees is the Beit HaMikdash, what he sees is the Batei Tfilah, what he sees is the Kol Yaakov, what he sees is our ability to, again, have that sulam and reach up to heaven, and that's what he wants to completely destroy. So the point of all of this, as I said, is I wanted to go back and to track some of the steps, took a couple of different steps in different directions regarding this teaching, which starts off with the Zohar and making a birur, is to see leaving Egypt, not just geographical, but there's a spiritual element which is essential. And that was also, when you go back to leaving Lavan, there was this element. That comparison between the two was already there in the Tikkun Zohar in its raw sense. The Vilna Gaon says, of course it's there. It's everything. It's the whole story. Everything is here. And even pointing out that's why on Pesach night we include it when we go back to Aramid Avid Avi, because it really is the same story. What I try to point out is at least some of what I think is the more obvious elements over here, as for all we know, we'll come back to this in another 10 years and then find another 20, 30, 40, 50 connections that the Vilna Gaon had in mind, but Bezrat Hashem, we'll do that, and we'll come back and we'll try to understand it again and go back further, because as I said, even though we saw a bit of it, I'm convinced that much more. Obviously, this all begins with the Eitz Hadat Tov Ra, and it all begins with the separation and the birur, knowing which tree to eat from, which not to eat from. So with Tu B'Shvat as well, you should know which tree you should be eating from, and you should not be eating from the dried fruits which come from Turkey. You should be eating. You should be eating from the fruits of Eretz Yisrael, and hopefully even a new fruit, be able to say a Shechianu. And I'm not sure how possible that is right now if it is from Israel, but Be'ezrat Hashem, we should all be able to enjoy the fruits of Eretz Yisrael for many, many years.